Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. It's such a thrill when someone invites you to speak about your work. I'll never get over that, I don't think. I hope I never get over that. Thank you, Len, for this tremendous welcome. And to the Noongar people, I would like to acknowledge the territory that we're on. It's becoming more of a commonplace to do that in Canada as well, although I think in some ways we have a long way to go. Thank you, Denise, for the incredible, for everything, right up until the last minute when we were scrambling with the PowerPoint, or the keynote presentation. So I didn't know what to write. I didn't know what to talk to you about. And I was going to sort of do a kind of recap of my thinking about human rights after the book, Human Rights in Camera, which, as Jane, that was a really excellent description, that for me, thinking about the history of human rights was really thinking about the way in which people responded to images. And so that created a kind of category of an international, or what Hannah Arendt talked about as a world spectator. And for me, that position of being a world spectator was sort of an unthought position in the history of human rights. Since then, I think, as Len alluded, that there's a way in which thinking about human rights has been often thought about as thinking about human wrongs. And I've been quite affected by that work, and I no longer want to think about human wrongs, I suppose. Or it's not that I don't want to think about them, it's just that there's a shift, I think, that I wanted to make. So it's a slightly different title than is the program. The original title would work, I think, still for the images I want to talk to you about. I've been quite affected by reading some of our own Canadian Indigenous scholars, people like Glenn Cothard, for example, he's a Yellowknife Dene person who's been quite vocal about rejecting the kind of politics of recognition. And then my own interest as the new work on dream life has taken me closer to thinking about the social imaginary. So I think some of that you'll hopefully see in the talk. It's very much a work in progress. I invite you to tell me if you think I'm wrong. Okay. What do you hang on the walls of your mind? The neatly typed question appears atop one of the 4x5 index cards that the Jewish-American photographer Eve Arnold used to record her thoughts. Arnold goes on to describe her game of solitaire, the way that as a novice photographer she assiduously collected her favorite images and filed them away in her imagination to bring them out during moments of stress and moments of quiet. What were the pictures? Arnold gives us a tantalizingly brief list. George Rogers' photographs of Nuba wrestlers from the southern Sudan. Henri Cartier-Bresson's portrayal of children playing in the ruins of Seville in the 1930s. Her fellow Magnum photographer Elliot Erwitt's whimsical series of dog dogs. The list seems like a collection of photographs that aim toward a kind of pictorial ideal of humanity, Arnold's own family of man, a collection of photographs that aims to preserve a kind of image of the dignity and diversity of human and non-human experience. One could add several of Arnold's own photographs to the list. For my part, I filed away her School of Nonviolence series in my own imagination, which I bring out in times of stress and times of quiet, a kind of reminder about fortitude. But it's Arnold's questions that concern me today, and in particular the first abidingly open and expansive inquiry. What do you hang on the walls of your mind? Like a shutter that just won't close, the photographer's query calls attention to the gap between the photographs we circulate in the name of human rights and the work that we hope that they will achieve in the social imaginary. More specifically, the question compels us to think about the distinction between pictures and images. A picture, I think, in Arnold's mind, denotes an object with formal qualities, something that can be hung on the wall or projected with light or printed on paper. The term image, in contrast, suggests a mental representation or an idea that may or may not have a graphic corollary. We dream in images, of course, and for the most part, these gossamer experiences elude pictorial capture. This is an important point. In fact, the images that hang on the walls of our mind often have very little to do with material reality. As Freud famously insisted, the imaginary world is governed by distortion. This distinction is also significant for human rights. The common definition of human rights is a set of moral principles that are enshrined in international or municipal law, quietly relies upon an idea, which is to say, a transcendent image of a human being as a creature who is in possession of inherent dignity and certain inalienable rights. In one way or another, human rights struggle, whether it be the 19th century anti-slavery crusades, the civil rights movement in the US in the middle of the century, or contemporary indigenous struggles, all seek, I think, to claim this idea, this image of the human being. So when we're fighting for human rights, what we're fighting for, to borrow H.G. Wells' beautiful phrasing, is at least in part a right to an image. It may be easier to come at this idea the other way around, which is to say focus on negative instances, occasions in which one is denied the right to an image. As any number of indigenous and anti-colonial scholars have taught us, colonialism can be understood as an imposition of an imperial imagination, and carried within this colonial imaginary is a whole set of other images. On one hand, colonial outposts, such as Canada and Australia, these settler colonial nations, have served as sites to preserve and extend the image of Western, or in this case, Britain's imagination, its idea of civilization. On the other hand, this process involves splitting off undesirable aspects of the society and projecting them elsewhere. Europe managed to get rid of its own savagery by projecting it onto the colonies. And more recently, President-elect Donald Trump has sort of brought this question of projection back into kind of thinking in political, as a form of political practice, frankly. The colonized population is then coaxed and cajoled into internalizing these negative images through a series of governance procedures, policies, and everyday interactions between citizens and non-citizens. As a result, these colonial images and the structural relations with which they are entwined come to be seen as more or less natural. And as many of us studied, of course, pictures do the work of either serving this colonial imaginary or trying to work against it. This everyday kind of process is rendered in graphic detail in a famous passage from Black Skin, White Masks, in which the anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon describes a brief encounter with a white child on a train. This is the 1950s, early 1950s in France. The child says, "Look, a Negro. Mama, I see the Negro, I'm frightened." At first, the encounter amuses Fanon, but he quickly realizes that he cannot escape this projection of his blackness, which is to say, he's trapped by the image of his, as he puts it, ethnic characteristics, battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all else, sure good eatin'. What we might all too easily dismiss then as the child's perception is in fact a projection, a psychological procedure which effectively seals Fanon into a crushing state of objecthood. He describes being fixed by the child's assertion, just as a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. The child imposes an image, or indeed a whole series of images, which for all of Fanon's extraordinary dexterity as a thinker and as a writer, he has great difficulty repudiating. The struggle to assert and claim a place in humanity is a constant thread amongst human rights discourse. What happens if we frame these struggles as claims to a right to an image, which is to say, to bring forward the imaginary dimension as central to human rights claims? And as a way to explore this idea further, I've begun assembling a series of scenes, or photographic situations, if you will, examples which seem to exemplify this dynamic. I only have time to talk about two of them today. As you start to collect sort of examples that somehow speak to you, you become a hoarder, then you start digging into them. And I only think I have time to talk about two. We can talk maybe later about the other examples that I think are significant. But both of these examples suggest that human rights struggle involves at its core a struggle over images. As you will see, these scenes pose interesting dilemmas about the relationship between pictures and images. And it seems one of the common ways we claim our right to an image is through pictures. But here Eve Arnold's question exposes a kind of trouble, an irreducible gap between the pictures we circulate in the name of human rights and the images that hang on the walls of people's mind. Okay, this is a reference to Aesop's fable, the famous Aesop's fable that, well, I'll tell you the fable later, I'll just tell you the story. In an article published in April 7th, 1849, the 1849 edition of his abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, Frederick Douglass took aim at a smile. The offensive expression was not his, although it appeared on the surface of his face. Douglass's grievance was launched as part of a review of a long-looked-for work produced by the Quaker abolitionist William Armistead. The volume in question, A Tribute for the Negro, spans some 564 pages and include florid accounts of the evils of slavery, testimony from a great variety of sources, and as he puts it, the moral, intellectual, and religious capacities of the colored population of mankind, and numerous biographical sketches of notable individuals such as Joseph Cinque, the leader of the slave revolt on La Amistad ship, Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, and Douglass himself appears in the book. Douglass's review of Armistead's book is ambivalent at best. Although he recommends the volume as a most valuable work, he simultaneously rails against a world that requires such a text. And here's what he says at one point in the review. Here is a large volume made of extracts in the sayings of authors, travelers, missionaries, sea captains, doctors, lawyers, and philosophers, and all to prove what? Simply that the present reviewer is a member of the human family and ought to be so regarded. If our dark cheek could reveal our feelings, words would be unnecessary to the beholder. What a fact to be handed down to coming generations that the Christian people of England and America had become so hardened by crime and blinded by prejudice that in the year 1849 they needed the light of a volume of nearly 600 pages to distinguish their brother from a beast in the field. Now, by 1849, Douglass was the author of the best-selling autobiography narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which is widely acknowledged as one of the most influential texts in the American anti-slavery movement. Many of his subsequent speeches have been hailed among the greatest oratory ever delivered. He was equally masterful in the domain of visual literacy. An early enthusiast of photography, Douglass has recently been kinged the most photographed American in the 19th century. He sat for more than 160 portraits during his lifetime, more than Abraham Lincoln, more than George Custer, and more than Red Cloud. There's a beautiful new collection of called Picturing Frederick Douglass, where they've tried to put this entire catalog together. It's an amazing text. I recommend it. Now, Douglass was as careful about his visual image as he was with his words. Even a cursory survey of his enormous catalog of portraits provides unmistakable evidence that he was self-reflexively engaged in constructing his own image. The portraits show the reformer's nuanced grasp of the politics of the face, or more accurately, perhaps, the politics of expression. Among the more than 160 portraits, only 3 show him smiling, one of which is his wedding portrait. The other 2 come from the very last years of his life. Throughout his life, Douglass consciously adopted what we might call a dignified expression, which is to say his portraits served as a kind of parallel claim to his visual claim to his human status. Or to be precise, Douglass's visual politics not only demanded inclusion into the human family, to include the terms of the Universal Declaration, claiming his supposedly inalienable rights as a human being, but more specifically, the reformer used photography as a means to assert his human dignity. Douglass taught us that the face is a particularly potent site to make such political claims. Given his sensitivity to the aesthetics of human rights, then, it might be no surprise that Douglass's review of Armistead's volume takes special aim at the book's so-called superior portraits and engravings. In his opening remarks, Douglass flatly states that the work would have been better off without these portraits, these pictures. Here's one. This is Cinque, the leader of the slave revolt on La Amistad. To be clear, here's Douglass. Here's the engraving of Douglass that appears in Armistead's book. He's taking aim at these engravings. The halftone process, which allows photographs to be mass reproduced, would not arrive for another 40 years. During this period, engravers were employed to produce illustrations, which were often cut from other visual sources. Douglass's criticism of these engravings takes aim at their failure to capture a likeness, but more significantly, he takes issue with the gap between the pictures and the images that hang on the walls of people's mind. Here is his remarks quoted in full, because to me these remarks are just so, you could spend a lifetime on them. But so I have 2 slides, and I've given you his remarks so you can read along with me. Okay, the engraving of brave Cinque falls far short of expressing the bold and majestic bearing of this heroic son of the forest. And of course, Douglass had met Cinque. That of Frederick Douglass we shall leave to others to criticize, begging only to remark that it has much more of a kindly and amiable expression than is generally thought to characterize the face of a fugitive slave. So he's furious that the engraver gave him a smile. Never having seen the other persons whom the additional portraits are designed to represent, we say nothing of them, but hope they are truer likenesses than either that of Cinque or Douglass. Before quitting the pictures, we shall venture one remark, which we've never heard expressed before, and which will perhaps be set down to the account of our Negro vanity. And it may be, not unjustly so, but we have presented it for what it may be worth. It is this: Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hand of white artists. It seems to us next to impossible for white men to take a likeness of black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features. And the reason is obvious. Artists, like other white persons, have adopted a theory respecting the distinctive features of Negro physiognomy. We've heard many white persons say that Negroes look all alike, and that they could not distinguish between the old and the young. They associate with the Negro face high cheekbones, distended nostril, depressed nose, thick lips, and retreating foreheads. This theory, impressed strongly upon the mind of an artist, exercises a powerful influence over his pencil, and very naturally leads him to distort and exaggerate these particularities, even when they scarcely exist in the original. The temptation to make the likeness of the Negro rather than of the man is very strong, and often leads the artist as well as the player to overstep the modesty of nature. There is the greatest variety of form and feature among us, and there is seldom one face to be found which has all the features usually attributed to the Negro. And there are those from which these marks of African descent, while their color remains unchanged, have disappeared entirely. I am black, but calmly, is true now as it was in the days of Solomon. Perhaps we should not be more impartial than our white brothers. I just love this part, which I included. Should we attempt to picture them? We should be as likely to get their lips too thin, noses too sharp and pinched up, their cheeks too lantern-like, their hair too lank and lifeless, and their faces altogether too cadaverous. White people are dead, as I think he's suggesting. We must let the picture go and console ourselves as Thomas Wilson once did, when he told us that we should become handsome if public opinion ever changed. For our part, we like a large nose, whether it be flat or sharp, no matter which, so the metal is there. Everyone to his taste, so he does not trample on human rights. So, as I understand this remark, Douglass is claiming his face and rejecting the idea of the Negro. And so there's a way in which he's committed to this imaginary dimension. And he hates the idea of engraving in this point for its fallibility, and he's sort of excited about photography. There's also this kind of lovely Beyonce echo here. I like my nose with Jackson 5 nostrils. But okay, let's focus on the pictures for a minute more. Armistead's engravings of the abolitionists was cut from the frontispiece of the first British edition of Douglass's narrative, the Dublin edition. The author disliked this image and complained to his publisher about it in 1846. He was not alone. Others readers disliked it too. When sending a copy of the narrative to a friend, Charles Dickens wrote, "There was such a hideous and abominable portrait of the author in the book, I have torn it out, fearing it might set you by anticipation against the narrative." The picture, we might say, did an injustice to Douglass's right to an image. Or perhaps more accurately, the picture failed to do justice to Douglass's right to a dignified image. It lacked the appropriate level of gravitas for a man who had to fight his way to fight his way to freedom. This question of dignity is important to human rights discourse. Since the 1948 Universal Declaration, the concept of an inalienable dignity has come to anchor contemporary human rights discourse. You won't find that term, dignity, in any of the antecedent the U.S. Declaration of Independence, nor the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen contain that word. It's a relatively new concept, and I have argued that it comes about in the era of photography. This question of dignity, a kind of embodied sense of well-being. Through his unparalleled brand of visual politics, Frederick Douglass teaches us that dignity lies at the border between the body and the imaginary plane. It is both an embodied sensibility and a property of belonging to a shared gaze. To be human involves claiming the right to a dignified image, to see and to be seen to exist. And since its invention, photography has served as one of the most important tools in this crucial political exercise. Okay, my second example is a much more contemporary one, and I tried to think, this one is sort of, I wanted to use this one because it's kind of a bridge. It still uses the politics of the face, but it's now a question about sort of mass politics. And here, one of my questions is that can pictures serve as a medium for a community's claim to a right to an image? And how does this claim work at the level of mass psychology? Okay, in 2011, the TED Foundation awarded its highest honor, a prize of $100,000, to a French artist who goes by the name JR. He's remained somewhat anonymous. JR got his start as a graffiti artist as a 15-year-old, but he made his name by illegally pasting photographic portraits of young people, his friends, from housing projects around Paris. He pasted these photographs, which are poster-sized, in the bourgeois parts of the city. This Portrait of a Generation series started making the nightly news in 2003 when riots broke out in Les Bousquets after 2 youths from the neighborhood were killed in a power station when they were fleeing from the police. As JR put it, this was the moment when he realized the power of paper and glue. He took his photographeur, as he calls it, method around the world. In the Middle East, he took portraits of Israelis and Palestinians and pasted them on both sides of the apartheid wall, challenging people to tell them apart. In Moro, Brazil, one of the poorest favelas in Rio, he organized one of the community to paste giant images of the women who'd lost sons to gang violence on the sides of their homes. The Brazilian media went wild with speculation about the eyes that had begun to mysteriously appear in the slums of Rio. For his TED Prize, JR launched Inside Out, a global art project, as he put it, which involves passing the process. The rules of the project are simple. The public is encouraged to gather at least 5 participants for what he calls a group action. You are to write a brief statement about a cause or a message, and then you take portraits of at least 5 individuals, send the files to Inside Out, and the studio will mail back 3 by 5 foot black and white posters for the participants to post in a public location of their choice. The response was overwhelming. Over the past 5 years, the Inside Out project has produced some 260,000 portraits and supported over 1,300 group actions in 129 countries around the world, including Perth, as I just discovered this morning. Perth also took part in the Inside Out practice. So I have 2 clips. The first clip is a very short one, just to give you a sense of JR's project. So you can see it's quite remarkable how people have sort of extended JR's. I love that last clip of the way they found a legal loophole to protect the shelters from being destroyed by calling them art shelters. It's kind of great. Inside Out is perhaps paradigmatic of the genre that is sometimes called participatory art, or sometimes called relational aesthetics, the art historians having a fight over the title of this category, as you might imagine. Emerging in the early 1990s, this kind of work has several distinctive characteristics. First, the involvement of an audience is the main focus of the work, and in JR's case, a mass audience. Second, a desire to erode the distinction between institutional and social space. This is kind of work that's often done not in art galleries. And 3, there's a kind of breakdown of the traditional distinction between artist and viewer. Here in this case, as JR says, he passes the process. I want to focus on one particular instance of Inside Out, one of the group actions, as a way to open up more questions about what might be involved in claiming a right to an image on a social scale. One of the first places that took JR up on his offer was a group of photographers and activists based in Tunisia. As I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone here, in 2011 was marked by a series of uprisings throughout the Arab world. What became known as the Arab Spring was sparked by a revolution that began in Tunisia at the end of 2010. 8 weeks after the President Ben Ali was deposed, and while the country was still very much in transition, a small group of local photographers attempted to mount an Inside Out inspired project in the streets of Tunis. JR felt compelled to pay them a visit. There are certain projects, he says, which he feels a need to witness for himself. And here, this is a long clip. It's about 7 minutes, so hang in there. I still don't know what to make of this, to be perfectly honest, so I'll give you my thoughts for now. This extraordinary sequence exemplifies some of the complex visual politics of the Inside Out project. On one hand, the group action can be read as an exemplar of the people's right to claim their own image, a kind of face politics on a mass scale. But JR's project still certainly bears the marks of a kind of colonial imaginary. Pinning icons on a map will always have a colonial connotation, of course. And Tunisia, we should remember, was under French colonial rule from 1881 to 1957. The Inside Out project has thus far escaped major criticism, which is extraordinary, frankly, to me, but this is not an entirely new figuration of the social contract. The decision to paste multiple portraits of Tunisian subjects in the same space as a sovereign's portrait, and I should point out that in Tunis and in much of Tunisia, the only portraits that were allowed to be publicly pasted were, of course, of the president. So this is a significant transformation, and this kind of occupation of the same space is what interests me in particular. It eerily calls to mind, I think, Abraham Boss's famous frontispieces to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. The engraving, which dates from 1651, was designed to visually illustrate Hobbes's argument about how sovereign power functions. In the picture, the sovereign's body is collectively constituted by his myriad subjects. All of these, I think you can see them there. All of these individuals stand with their backs, almost all. My colleague Mark Reinhardt has pointed out that not all of them, but almost all of them, stand with their backs to their viewer, gazing up at the sovereign's head, suggesting that sovereign power is legitimated, indeed created, through the choice of each individual to alienate his or her own rights and powers. The Leviathan is a book about how human beings are emancipated from insecurity and terror by authoring their own subjection. Without a strong sovereign, Hobbes argues, the Commonwealth would fall into civil war, or what he calls the war of all against all, an argument that seems somewhat prescient in the Arab world today. Not that I'm making an argument about advocating for Hobbesian forms of sovereignty, but just I think you can see what I mean about the kind of endless sectarian war. This example from Tunisia leaves us with more questions than answers. How do a people claim their right to an image? How are the transformations at the level of the social imaginary actually achieved? How can photographs serve such projects? One of the interesting things, if we think about the JR's project as a kind of parallel to Hobbes, is that rather than the subjects facing the sovereign, of course, in JR's project, the faces face out, for lack of a better term. How do photographs serve such projects at the level of the social imaginary, or how do they thwart them? What does a democratic revolution look like? Does JR's Inside Out project only promise to reproduce the very configurations of a colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that human rights movements have historically sought to transcend? Questions, at any rate, that might help us begin to think further about how photography can both serve and trouble human rights. Thank you.